People now. Great, wonderful. Hi, Alan. So nice to have this opportunity to do this interview with you. We met, I can't remember, was it in 2009 that you came to?
Oh, I don't know. I can't remember. Yeah. I'm too old to remember those things, but it was at Findhorn.
Yeah.
I remember that.
First you came to Findhorn, and then I also always remember when I went to CIS.
Oh, yes, that's right. You did.
We went to the National History Museum, which I loved. Still have the T-shirt.
Great. Yeah. No, I remember that because I pulled out into the traffic going the wrong way. I think I scared your pants off of you, but well, the policeman pulled up. You seemed rather nervous. I said, no, it's cool. Sure enough, he got out, held up the traffic so we could turn around.
Great. But, yeah. So I would love to, because for so long, this word, like more and more people are using the word consciousness every day now and are saying that ultimately the shift we now need to make is so deep in terms of redesigning, as David Orr would call it, redesigning the human presence on Earth within the lifetime of the generations alive today. That's a tall order. And most of the more intelligent perspectives that I read on this all agreed that ultimately we need a shift in consciousness before we have a chance of redesigning, because it's ultimately in the way we see the world, the way we see ourselves, and the way we understand the relationship between consciousness and matter that so much of the problems that we've created are actually rooted. And it's one of those words that lots of people use, but you wrote a wonderful book called Consciousness Explained Better. Short little book that was a take on Daniel Dennett.
Daniel Dennett's old book, Consciousness Explained. Okay. Or some people say it should have been Consciousness Explained Away, because, he's such a reductionist. In fact, he's a physicalist, I would say, and he's proud of it. So, yeah.
What one of the best statements about consciousness that I've read is from an article that you co-authored with Ken Wilber in 2010, and I'm just going to read this statement here. It's consciousness is so much more than an evolutionary accident or an epiphenomenon of biochemical processes in our heads. Consciousness is in fact fundamentally woven into the universe itself. What we are saying is that to some degree of subjectivity is indeed present in all the way up and all the way down in the evolutionary ladder, from the tiniest quarks to the biggest brains. This consciousness can be loosely described as a perspective-making and perspective-taking system that creates, collects, organizes deeper, wider, and more sophisticated points of view as it develops. So it's an evolutionary developmental view that starts with that basically any perspective taking is an act of bringing forth a world. And we bring forth the world together in that jewel of Indra from all those perspectives, whether they're human perspective taking or whether it's a sequoia tree taking perspective of its environment. Am I understanding that correctly, or could you elaborate on that paragraph?
Well, I think you said it quite well. By the way, I love that quote, and I don't know where it's at. Maybe you could send it to me. I don't really remember where it's at, but or writing it, but it sounds right.
I'll find this. I think it was on one of Ken Wilber's websites, an article.
Okay. Well, no, but it's a great quote, and it's sort of, well, it brings up several points that we could talk about quite a bit. It sort of prefigures what today we're seeing more and more philosophers and scientists shifting to a kind of panpsychist view. Panpsychism, that is, consciousness is somehow fundamental to the world and to the universe. Christian de Quincey wrote a wonderful book about this years ago that Ervin Laszlo was so impressed with. He had a whole conference based on it. I think it's called Radical Knowing. But if you go to Christian De Quincey, he's sort of an independent scholar on the West Coast. He has his own website and he teaches courses, but he's written several books. But this was his first one, and which he makes a good case for the idea that consciousness is interwoven, or I shouldn't say, it's a feature of the universe. And so it's not exactly panpsychism, but pretty close to it. And he makes a good case for that. The idea of panpsychism, the idea that consciousness permeates everything in some sense or other. See, I'm going to go to the big meeting at Tucson in a month or two. This is the biggest conference in the world, and it meets in Tucson every other year, which is its home base. But then next year it'll be in Italy, for example. Last year it was in Switzerland. So it's in different places. But I've been coming since the beginning, 26 or 27 years. They've been having this, and it's directed by Stuart Hameroff, who's probably the most prominent scientist in the world, who argues for quantum events of the brain as a root of consciousness. And he works at the University of Tucson or Arizona there. He's an anesthesiologist by trade, but he's one of these very bright guys. I think his first book years ago was on quantum computing. And he got together with David Chalmers, who was at the time, 20 some years ago, a young philosopher. And the two of them began to organize these conferences. Well, Chalmers first argued that consciousness is information. And he has his earliest book's a very good book on consciousness, although he tries to argue for this theory of consciousness as information. Which could be right or could be wrong, but the point is that in the last 3 or 4 years, he's become a panpsychist. And so when people of his recognition and caliber in the academy become I mean, this is a guy that hangs out with Daniel Dennett, for example, and with the elite, what I would call Northeastern school of philosophers, who are very distant and very arrogant in their own way and very elite. And here he is, somehow he's gotten in with them. I'm not sure exactly how, but he's done it, and he's become a panpsychist. So he's an example of the way the wind is blowing, if I can put it that way, because Ken Wilber and I have always been panpsychists in some sense, or we've always felt that consciousness is shared by virtually all highly organized living organisms. And we're friendly to the idea that maybe it goes down deeper than that. Maybe molecules or ultimately atomic particles have some kind of pre-conscious, if not conscious, element to them. It's really hard to describe, but
what I find interesting is that, like yesterday, I talked to Fritjof Capra, and we were spent quite some time talking about the Santiago theory of cognition, and we also talked about the question, what is life? And for me, it seems like the question, what is life and what is consciousness, are actually very closely linked. And to some extent, Maturana and Varela, very much influenced by Gregory Bateson, I believe, put forward this theory that to some extent explains both what is life and what is consciousness, in a similar way as that quote I just read by you and Ken, because it is about that it's the act of distinction, the act of perspective taking that actually defines self and world, the individual and the so felt environment, but that actually Einstein called this an illusion of consciousness, that in the act of taking the perspective, we begin to believe that there is an other, but that other is only a larger dimension of the wider self becoming aware of itself. And I know this sounds like it's very difficult to put these things in language, but I've been grappling with this for years. Does that resonate with you at all?
Well, I'll go halfway with you. I'm a big enthusiast of Allan Metzner's concept of autopoiesis, which I think is, really basic to the organization of life, self-building, self-creating. Without going into it in detail, I'm sure you're very familiar with it, and a lot of people who hear this tape will be familiar with it. But it's simply the idea that the processes of the organism, say a single cell or a living animal or any living creature, that in sum, the output of the whole process is the organism itself, or the cell itself. The entire complex metabolism of a living cell is in the business of producing that living cell in the next moment. I think that's a very basic and important idea. I have to say that, no criticism intended, but I was never impressed with the notion of inaction much. And I could say more, but I don't know whether you want me to talk more about it. Well, people get really excited about inaction, and I don't see anything new in it, frankly. That Jerome Bruner wrote about the importance of inaction in cognitive systems and learning back in the 60s. John Dewey wrote about it in the 19th century.
You mean inaction, the notion of bringing forth a world, that we are...
Well, now, wait a minute. Now, that's bringing forth a world is, now that's not quite the same thing for me.
Yeah, that's why I would like you to just define what you mean by inaction so people understand.
Well, my understanding of inaction is it's just that the organism is in a very active relationship with the environment or with other organisms. And so there's this action going back and forth. And so, this is as I said, in John Dewey, it was in Jerome Bruner, it's in Piaget. It's got a new name, but I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you I was excited about it, but I'm just not. I think the idea of bringing forth the world is an interesting turn of phrase, but I don't think there's any news in it. Basically, what I knew Varela, by the way, but not real well. He was part of Irvin Laszlo's group, and when Irvin started writing about weird and wonderful things like life continuing after death, he got off the boat. He he didn't want any part of that. So, but I did see him in a number of meetings. So where was I with this? I think it's a different way. I mean, okay, open your eyes and look around the room. Now you've created a world.
No,
you've created a world in your own experience, and you can interact with it. I don't see anything more profound in it than that. But you have to remember that Varela and Maturama's concept of an organism is a very closed sort of thing. They use this metaphor at length of a submarine. It's like a submarine. It's got this periscope, and it's this little periscope. I used to argue all the time with my friend Soren Breyer, who's an eminent somaticist, semioticist actually, biosemioticist. He ran the journal for years. And he would always take their side. And I would say, well, I don't agree with this. I don't think an organism is a closed system. And Soren would say, well, it only means closed in terms of processes. And so we would go back and forth. But that's an important part of the way the thing came down for me, is that an organism is a closed system. They use the metaphor of the submarine with the periscope, and then they could look out this periscope at a very limited world, and then it could connect with other organisms and with the environment, but it was a very limited connection. And it just, I never could reconcile. Now, maybe I'm not smart enough.
No,
I mean, I know a lot of smart people think about this, but I think the organism is open in all kinds of ways, ecologically open, energetically open, and so on. So I never got on board with that.
I mean, I personally, and this is more of a intuitive understanding based on some study, but I sense that we might actually have it wrong, focusing too much on the individual organism or even the individual species. And
no argument with me.
If we understood life as a planetary process that is, through this act of perspective taking, basically becoming conscious of itself more, and therefore getting better feedback on how to organize the complexity that it creates in order to be better at creating conditions conducive to life, if you want to kind of frame it under Janine Benyus's nice biomimicry, sort of that's what life does. It creates conditions conducive to life. And for me, there's, on the one hand, the notion that it doesn't really make sense that there's a dead matter universe out there, and then at some level of complexification of dead bits organizing each other, life pops up.
Miracle.
At a later point, the life bits organizing each other, some of these life forms have a bit of consciousness. I think it actually makes even logically more sense to assume that the whole thing is to some degree alive, and the whole, or I shouldn't even say thing, I should say being, the whole being of the universe is to some degree alive and to some degree conscious. But as it complexifies into more and more complex ways of taking perspective, it can capture more of a perspective. As you say in this sentence, like, I love this bit of perspective making, perspective taking system that creates, collects, organizes deeper, wider, and more sophisticated point of views as it develops. And for me, if we got to a point where, which I think we've been in some of the wisdom traditions, I understand the jewel net of Indra in the Vedanta as an expression of exactly that concept, that the whole perceives itself through the parts, but the whole also comes forth through the participation of the parts in kind of Henry Bortoft's authentic wholeness kind of way. And so for me, the big shift is to stop, because now everybody talks about fighting climate change so humanity survives. And if we identify more deeply with life as a planetary process, then our concern would be life continuing, and our actions in it are like humble gardeners contributing, basically doing what life needs to do, which is creating conditions conducive to life. And to make that maturity jump that we now need to do as a species, we need to re-identify with that wider process. Just as, like Goethe said 200 years ago, 250 years ago, who doesn't see nature everywhere sees her nowhere in the right light. Again, somewhat a panpsychist worldview, because when he speaks of nature, he also speaks of the process of awareness taking.
Well, not necessarily panpsychist. It's just a kind of seeing the universe as a living whole.
Yeah,
he reminds me of Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was not a philosopher, but he saw life everywhere and in everything, and was really a mystic in a lot of ways. But yeah, I like what you're saying. There were two things. One I wanted to remember to mention Irvin Laszlo's recent book, The Intelligent Universe, or something like that. He published this within the last year or two. They said he writes books every weekend, I think, and you can hardly keep up with him. He's 10 years older than me. I don't know how he does it. I hope I'm half as smart as he is at his age. But he makes an amazingly intelligent and well thought out argument that the cosmos as a whole is a kind of living process, living organism, really, with checks and balances and growth processes and autopoietic processes at every level. I mean, this is an amazing drawing together of ideas that are out there and have been out there.
Mm-hmm.
But to think of the whole universe as like a single organism in its levels of organization and structure and communication within itself, it's just a wonderful, and he convinced me. I think it's one of the most important things he ever did. I think it's one of the most important books that's ever been written, even though it's just a little book, because it gives you a vision of the cosmos as a unified process, and that process is growing.
Yeah.
And not in any trivial sense, but it's evolving. It's evolving at many levels all the time.
And it's a dynamic evolutionary perspective rather than a dead mechanical universe that we've had for so long and that led us astray in our way. I mean, this is what I mean when earlier when we were talking about bringing forth the word. I love Henry Botoft's notion of organizing ideas with regard to that. And that's where I find that's where the shift to some extent needs to happen, is we need new organizing ideas that allow us to, for example, think of the universe as a living organism and Gaia, the living planet.
Yeah, and this brings back another point I want to say before I forget, because I'm getting old and I forget what I want to talk about half the time. In fact, I may have just forgotten it.
Just to prove your point.
Where were we a minute ago? Okay, it'll come back. Oh, I remember. You said we're fighting climate change. There's talk about fighting. You know, that especially, I don't know about in Europe, but in America, this has been a real problem. And everything we don't like, we're going to fight. We're going to fight diseases. We fight old age. We're going to have a battle against poverty. We're going to fight poverty. You know, and it's such a poor way to go about solving a problem.
Exactly.
So, you know, we're not going to fight the environment. And if we do, we'll lose. What we got to do is get on board and do what we can do to facilitate the natural processes. That's just another way of saying what you were saying.
I on purpose quoted these people not by agreeing with them, because I think that that's exactly the wrong organizing idea. It's yet another. It starts from a problem rather than the potential. And I think that if we really go in working with consciousness, then what we need to start from is working from potential, from the potential of us waking up to our core identity with this larger evolving process. Whether we keep it for a while, I think we'd already have a massive achievement if people understood their unity with Gaia as a living planet at the planetary scale. But I think that I haven't read Evan's latest book, but the notion of speaking of the entire universe as an evolving organism makes complete sense to me, because I
can send you a copy of the book. Of course, other people listening to us will have to go get their own, but I have at least a pre-publication copy of it somewhere. I'll just shoot it your way. Well, let me comment on this a little bit. As a person that's been, as you know, very much involved in the consciousness field, the consciousness area. And I often hear that, you know, and this is what Irvin's all about. We need to change our consciousness. He writes about it all the time. But I hate to say it's not that simple, but it's not that simple, because, you know, I'm a real developmentalist. So I'm like Ken Wilber.
Yeah.
Okay. And now if we were all like, you know, Goethe or Walt Whitman, we would change our consciousness, already be changed. But so if you look at developmental stages, see, I'm a psychologist by training, and most of my work is really psychology, and Wilber really has kind of become a psychologist. And he does a very good job with this of pointing out that what's the world perspective at each developmental stage.
Exactly.
We identify with our with our own family. Then as we grow, we identify with our social group, our church, whatever community. And then as we grow, we identify with our maybe our nation. And then eventually we can identify with our own species. But you've got to practically be a Buddhist saint before you can identify with all life. And that's not really the end of it. You want to identify with the whole cosmos. So we don't have the time or the means or the likelihood, this is the realistic side of it for me, of promoting and facilitating that kind of growth in large numbers of people. We'd like to, but it's just not realistic. What is realistic is finding at each level what is needed to facilitate things at all levels or at higher levels. That is, and Ken Wilber's written about this quite a bit. He calls it the scale wizard or the growth wizard. But if you want to talk to people, for example, Republicans in the US, you've got to talk to them about what they're interested in.
Yeah.
Their own security, the security of their children, the future of their children. I think most of them are kind of interested in that. You've got to find leverage points that are different for different developmental levels and what people want and what they need at those levels. So that's not general philosophy. That's not, and I disagree with Urban on this. We're not going to pop the world into a new consciousness. We'd like to.
This is exactly. Thank you for speaking to that, because that's where I was going. I find, I mean, Urban is one of the people who really have promoted this paradigm shift story. And I find there's deep wisdom in the fact that when Donella Meadows wrote her paper, Places to Intervene in a System, there's a first version and a second version of that paper. In the first version, she ends at the level of paradigm. She says that's the highest leverage point. And then 10 years later, just before she died, she wrote another version of the same paper, which later ended up in her posthumous book, where she says, no, there is another level, which is to go beyond paradigm. And the way I interpret that is exactly what you're saying, is not to make the mistake, which we constantly do in the history of humanity, of overswinging the pendulum, of going from one extreme view to another opposing extreme view, like a thesis antithesis, rather than coming into a synthesis that has exactly that wisdom that you just spoke to, that we will never live on a planet where a baby is born with a kind of Humboldt-Goethe type consciousness. Yeah, it's part of evolving. And so we need to, like, I mean, what you just said, like the adage that spiral dynamics likes to say, you have to speak to people where they're at and not where you want them to be. How do we communicate about this and keep the spiral or this developmental pathway, the Wilber-Combs Matrix, open enough and healthy enough so at each developmental stage, people can live out that particular view of the world without sabotaging the future of life on Earth. Because what we've got right now is that people are stuck in, like in spiral dynamics, color language terms, they're stuck in unhealthy blue or unhealthy orange or even unhealthy red. So they're highly competitive, or they're highly dogmatic, or they're highly competitive in a more sort of intellectual career kind of way. And how do we get people into a space where we heal each of those levels and make them regenerative, so people can go through that cycle and keep, transcend and include, as Wilber likes to call it, keep the best of that perspective, be able to drop into that perspective if life conditions require so, but to constantly keep the pathway open to a wider and deeper understanding of our unity with life and the universe.
Well, you've outlined the problem very well.
I
I
hope you
wish
agree
I
with the
had the answer to it. I've never claimed to be a person with practical answers to real world problems, but I think you've outlined the issue very well. And we're facing some very difficult problems politically and personally. It's always been a characteristic of organisms, especially higher organisms, to go for short-term gains over long-term punishment or long-term losses. So, and that's kind of what we're doing with the environment. I think we're saying, oh, well, we got a few years, let's enjoy life, and not really addressing long-term problems. Although ironically, it seems like some of the countries in the world that are least democratic are most serious about China, for example, about looking at what's going to be down the road. But I don't really know how to do this. As Ken points out, you have to speak to people in their own language at their own level.
There's a wonderful,
in ways that make sense to them.
There's a wonderful paper that I take it you know Barrett Brown, don't you?
I do, not real well though. I certainly know who he is and have met him.
He wrote a piece for I think it was in Cosmos Journal that was entitled "Communicating Sustainability," where he used the sort of inspired by Wilber, inspired by spiral dynamics, based on Sean Esbjørn Hagen's work and Michael Zimmerman's work. He teased apart different perspectives on the environmental issue. I can't remember the whole thing, but he has like the eco warrior and the eco strategist. And
well, I'd love to see it if you come across it.
Yeah.
I don't want to send you on a fishing trip on your computer.
No, I'll send you.
But I would love to see that, and I would love to see, or a reference to at least the book you mentioned previously with paradigms, and then it was, you said it was written, the essay or what it was written 10 years later and published posthumously. Yeah, I'm not familiar with this, and I would really like to see it.
Yeah. No, I gladly send you links to both of them.
Great.
I mean, because you've done so much work also with art and literature and the cultural aspect of the human expression of where we basically perceive the world, and then we try to make sense of that experience through art and culture. And I often feel like I had this wonderful moment in 2006 when I visited David Orr at Oberlin and interviewed him about his work, and I asked him what he thought the dimension of spirituality and the sacred was in the transition that is now ahead of us. And David gave me a really good answer where he said a number of things, but among them he said, before we can find meaningful answers and sensible answers to what we need to do to be sustainable and how we might go about achieving that, we have to ask ourselves a much deeper question, which is, what is it about our very young species that right now is one of the youngest on the planet? Like we haven't even lived 1% of the normal average lifetime of a species on Earth. What is it about us that could be used in favor of our species as an argument of why we should have a chance of living a few more 10,000s or even millions of years? From your deep study of the human condition, what makes you hopeful rather than distraught about our species?
I don't know that I can really answer that very well. You know, there's something radically different about human beings compared to other species, or at least almost radically different. I see that orangutan has recently gained personhood in a court somewhere. I have to double check the article, but there's something about the human intelligence and the human mind that's just radically different. What can I say? And we get one of the first signs of intelligence we see evolutionary is art appearing in caves, for example, and musical instruments such as flutes made from animal bones and so on. So I view the arts, including, well, the humanities in general, is one of the most valuable features of human existence. And it borders on spiritual. It's hard to make a distinction, really, because throughout history, a great deal of art has been spiritual, and you can't hardly separate them. Same is true with music. But why we're worth more than other organisms, I don't really know that we are. I don't really have an answer for why we should continue to exist, except that I'm one of them. And yeah.
I wasn't at all trying to imply that in any way we are more worth it than others, but what are, and I think what you did answer it, because there are expressions that we, like in the answer to that question, David also said that we are meaning-seeking creatures, and he actually started at exactly the same place where you just started, from that first time where you spit some paint against the and on a cave wall to have that imprint. That's a sign of a species that is asking, who am I? Where do I come from? Where am I going?
Well, there you go. That's right.
And that it's this process of meaning creation that, where I also feel like maybe we can create a convincing enough narrative of our past, our significance, and our potential of serving life that could be expressed in slightly different language, with slightly different sort of hot buttons and cold buttons, so to speak, to speak to the different levels of consciousness that you and Ken mapped out, that the developmental path, but have a common theme that actually includes in the narrative that journey of deepening of perspective, broadening as part of being connected. I'm thinking out loud here.
Well, you've thought about this more deeply than I have. That's pretty clear. I'm a big fan of Jean Gebser's view of, well, he didn't call it evolution of consciousness because he didn't want to get tangled up with some of the evolutionary arguments that have and do go on, but he certainly looked at evolution as a developmental process, consciousness over time. He has these various social, psychological stages, and he talks about integral consciousness. And I think he talks about it in a way that is more satisfying to me personally. As I want to say, I don't want to criticize Ken Wilber, but I will say that Ken is a very cognitive guy. I think of him as very Apollonian. He's the brilliance of the mind. And Gebser's notion of integral he said, here's what he said: to be integral is to live all structures at all times. Now, Ken would disagree with that because he's, you want to go up levels. And as you go up levels, the lower levels come under control of the higher levels. And it's a whole different kind of concept. It's much more Piagetian, I guess. But what Gebser was interested in was having all levels active at any moment. And when you think what this means, magical is about poetry, about music, especially about music. Mythic is about the imagination. Mental is, of course, we all know what mental is. We've got too much of it. So the point being that a rich life, somebody asked me once, how would you educate a person or train them for integral consciousness. And I said, send them to a liberal arts college, let them learn music and literature and philosophy, and use their mind and use their emotions. And so, you know, when I look around my office, I have several translations of the Odyssey and the Iliad, for example, and mythic stories and so on. And these enrich life. I'm not a very religious person, but religion is about myth in a deep kind of way. So these are the things that give life meaning.
For me, that Gebser perspective of integral is so much healthier than that. Like whether Ken is doing this actively or passively, I don't think he's meaning to do it actively. Somehow the reading of a lot of people in the integral or the spiral dynamics community, I mean, I used to teach on courses the principles of spiral dynamics, and it didn't matter how many times I said it's not about types of people, it's about types in people. It's a developmental thing. Everybody at the end of the class, people will go, "Oh, you're so blue. Oh, you're so orange." And
oh, well, that's the risk of that kind of view.
And people would get competitive, and it's the same if you look in the consultancy world. Like everybody's there's a whole bunch of people out there who set up consultancies to help companies to become teal organizations or to make the jump.
I've heard people ask me how to do that,
and I find that just sets up a false competitiveness and a one-upmanship of, oh, I'm so much better because I can see the world from a turquoise perspective, instead of saying we need the whole healthy spectrum.
Well, I agree. And it's difficult because each of us is at our own place, sees the world from our own perspective in some sense. So it involves a lot of humility and recognizing that other people have valid points of view. And in order to get anywhere and move forward in any practical, political, real world sense, we have to get inside of those and help those people actualize the best parts of those perspectives they have. So, for example, what perspective is it where you find traditional religions, Mormonism, for example? Well, there's no point in arguing with them about it or trying to, you know, move them on unless you've got a lot of time on your hands and they're willing to listen. But what can you do to facilitate their worldview in a way that is compatible with others and will help in the bigger picture? Now, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You've thought about these things much more than me. I'm essentially a psychologist and a philosopher.
But I just would love to, like, what for me is so nice to be able to just compare and contrast, like, because a lot of this view that I've developed is also influenced by one of my mentors, Brian Goodwin, who was a biologist.
Oh, Brian is wonderful.
Yeah. And Brian was the first, like, from a complexity perspective, to say it doesn't really make sense to explain life and consciousness ex nihilo. It makes so much more sense. It pervades the entire complexity. And when like at the beginning, the quote that I read at the beginning, you say consciousness is not an epiphenomenon of the brain. Brian also completely pointed this out, that, and Gregory Bateson, that mind and consciousness is not inside this skull coming out of just brain activity. Why do you say that? And like, I agree, but where do you see the seat of consciousness then?
Oh, well, now that's a whole different question. I think probably looking for the seat of consciousness is probably a wrong-minded question.
Yeah, maybe that was bad. No, why do you say that? Like, how do we get away from the view that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of brain activity, and how can we explain it in a different.
Yeah, well, you're right at the heart of one of the deepest enigmas that we know of, the relationship of the mind to the brain. And it's full of paradoxes. As I said, I tend to be something of a panpsychist, which means that I think consciousness is widely distributed in the cosmos and really a part of it, and certainly a part of higher organisms. But with the brain, it's very, I mean, I'm teaching a course on consciousness right now, and here on the one hand, we know that certain kinds of brain disorders profoundly affect consciousness. In fact, we had a whole seminar at one of the Tucson meetings a few years ago about the locked-in syndrome. Yeah. This is when a person's had a serious stroke and they're conscious and awake and they can't control anything of their body except usually their eye movements. You know, there was a movie and a book called The Butterfly and the Diving Bell, written by a person who was actually in the locked-in syndrome, but was able to communicate by looking at letters one after another, really dictating the book. Okay, so I have students that would like to think consciousness is free of the brain, and when they put up with that sort of thing. On the other hand, we do know that people have out-of-the-body experiences that seem to be quite valid. These have been studied, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in near-death experiences. Clearly, people have experiences out of the body. Well, they seem to be out of the body, and they seem to locate themselves out of the body. I could talk a lot about that. That's the kind of thing that interests me. But the fact is that consciousness can, in some sense, be out of the body, and in some very real sense, is non-local, as a lot of people are liking to call it nowadays. So how is that possible? Why is it so connected to the brain and so independent of the brain at the same time? I don't know. It's a mystery.
Same. I mean, this is again an area of science that some people find hard to venture into. But Dean Radin's work on remote viewing, for example, there just seems to have been enough documented cases of people being able to remote view, which would kind of speak to the non-local potential.
Oh yeah, Dean. Yeah, he's got a book. You probably have seen it, a year or two old, called Real Magic.
I haven't seen it, no.
Oh, it's a great little book. I actually wrote to him about it because I wrote a book years and years ago on synchronicity. And he has a whole section of synchronicity, synchronistic events in that book, which he attributes to magic, real magic. And I don't disagree with him. But we approach it from two different directions, and we both seem to be coming to the same conclusions. For example, during the founding of Findhorn, there were, what's his name? Peter Caddy. Yeah, I mean, he created the whole place out of either magic or synchronicity, or however you want to call it. It was just an amazing story. Actually, I heard him talk about it. You've probably met him. But where am I with this? Clearly, remote viewing is very real when it works. And there's just so many experiences people have, out of the body experiences during surgery, when they can tell you what the room looked like from up at the ceiling, or even maybe they went down the hall and can tell you what was going on down there.
Well, another whole area that I know that some of your colleagues at CIS have been investigating is, and for me this is also a deeper question of inquiry, is like in my past I've done some experimenting with psychoactive substances that expand your perception in a certain
yeah, we have a new program in that right now, actually. A research program.
I keep wondering whether one of the reasons why we disconnected so profoundly from life as the wider community that actually makes it possible for us to live our life, our deep interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh called it, with the more than human world. To my mind, maybe our taboo on these type of sacred plants and the use of these sacred plants has closed the door of our breadth of the awareness that our species through its evolution has just always been engaged with. Like, I mean, there's even people who suggest that possibly that's what enabled the jump from a primate brain that is pretty complex and does pretty complex things to a Homo sapiens or Homo habilis brain that clearly is more complex than that. And also in terms of behavioral pattern and spectrum, that maybe the use of these plants has actually been a key element in our evolution.
You've been reading Terence McKenna, haven't you?
Yeah, among other things. What's your take on that? I mean, I think that
I have no idea.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I really don't have any idea. We're seeing, especially here in California, but not, I think all over the U.S., there's a resurgence of serious interest in psychotropic, now they're calling them entheogens,
Mm-hmm.
what we used to call psychedelic drugs or agents. And these have clearly been a feature of human experience, I think, for as long as there have been humans. Mm. One of the popular ones right now, I shouldn't use the word popular, but, you know, is, what's it called now? I'm speaking too quick. Ayahuasca.
Yeah.
Don't try this at home. Very powerful drug, yeah. But I have students now who have had psychedelic experiences and haven't had them since the 60s. So research is going on. It's now becoming at least accepted that these drugs might be helpful in medical ways. But whether they help birth the human mind or not, I don't know. I certainly wouldn't argue against that idea. I think if you go back far enough, people are.
Yeah, I don't think we will ever find a clear answer to that, but I think it is a valid question to explore, because I mean it does, from my experiences, particularly with psilocybin, it really brings you more into your intuitive, connected animal body and your whole way of perceiving.
Oh, psilocybin will do it. Mescaline does that too. Mescaline does that too. It makes you very embodied in a way, probably horny.
And it's another way of connecting with the wider.
Yeah, really, yeah.
But yeah, I just sense that maybe we've possibly through the Catholic Church. I don't know when that taboo came in so strongly, but the taboo of the use of these substances is partially the giving over the spiritual guidance to a priest rather than to actively or in community type of experiences and deeper spiritual connection to a wider whole through ceremony. With, I mean, there's a big difference I find between the ceremonial use of these substances and the kind of recreational use of these substances. I think the recreational use can be very dangerous and kind of pleasure seeking and not necessarily healthy, but the using them as sacrament as a way of
I hear you.
Is a difference.
But what we call the recreational use is often valuable in opening up new channels of understanding and reality. I've met, and you have too, I'm sure, people who have sort of awakened to a larger universe through LSD or some other agent, and then pursued a life of searching and, you know, a broader life of interests and searching and looking into oneself because of that.
I would count myself into that category. I don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg, but yeah, I learned.
Well, of course, that was the problem in the 60s. People would take these drugs and then they wouldn't be Republicans anymore. So, yes.
That's why they so strongly crack down on them. But
by the way, we just lost a month or two ago a friend of mine that lived very near me, Ralph Metzner.
mm-hmm.
Probably there was no man alive who knew as much about alternative states of consciousness and psychoactive agents as Ralph Metzner, who continued to write about these things throughout his whole life. And as long as we're talking about him, I'm talking about him. One of his last books was called The Ecology of Consciousness, which is, the title's a little tricky because it suggests that it's involved in his green consciousness work, which is a little different. But The Ecology of Consciousness is just a huge book of every topic you can think of, collecting his experience. Totally fascinating.
I read a lot of Metzner 20 years ago when I was at Schumacher College. I haven't read anything since, so I'll pick up on that. There's a couple of more things that I wanted to get your perspective on, because so like there's these big questions: what is life? What is consciousness? But there's also one that I think might be a little bit downriver from it, which is what is time? Like the way we perceive.
That's a good one.
So much of how we perceive time and how we locate ourselves with relationship to the past, the present, and the future, maybe even the sense that we currently have of that linear era of time that says the past is behind us and the future is in front of us, is, to my mind, the emergent property that, like, it's an experience that emerges out of how we explain our participatory agency in the world. So basically, if we don't, like there seems to be an illusion of time. It makes, for me, perfect sense that, like, J.G. Bennett had this very complex notion of time, using all these Greek terms like hypaxis and so on, where he opened up the possibility that the past and the future are co-present in the one place that we can ever only be, which is the experiential moment of now. What's your take on time and its relationship?
It's totally baffling. I've been fascinated by time myself for many years. Recently, I've realized how tightly it's connected to the question of free will. For example, William James talked about this quite a bit. You know, if you, well, there's what's called the block universe. You're probably familiar with this notion. James talked about, well, the block universe just says that the universe is some big multidimensional block. I think you would find it in Einstein. Any system that says you can move forwards and backwards in it suggests that it somehow is fixed. It's, you know, so the block universe, if you believe in time travel, you believe in a block universe, because it's still there somewhere and you can go backwards and forwards. And of course, if you stick to very traditional physics, you can run the equations backwards and forwards. It's a very Newtonian view. So that's the block universe. And probably most views of evolution and of time come somehow out of the block universe view. But you can't have free will in a thing like that, I don't think. It suggests everything is already predetermined, forwards and backwards. So where's the free will? The other view, one I'm a big proponent of, but doesn't allow time travel, so it's too bad for some of the stories, is the process view, in that time is really defined by the ongoing process of the cosmos, forward process. You can't go backwards. In fact, it's very closely related to complexity theory and chaos.
Mm-hmm.
That when you drop a cube of sugar in a cup of hot coffee, it dissolves and the molecules go in every direction. Well, that's a process view of the way time works, in fact. And you can't run it backwards, you can't put it back together again, although maybe Newton could, but you and I can't. So I'm trying to remember, there's a physicist who has written about this a lot and continues to write, very popular. I could dig him out and send him to him. I'm thinking of Solomov or Somosky or something. I'm dyslexic. What's that?
David Bohm had a very interesting angle on time, that saw time much more, as a process.
Well, he was a deep process thinker.
Yeah.
But it was really, who was it that developed the view of time really in a fundamental way? I should have made notes because I have trouble remembering. He's a Nobel-winning physicist that talks about creativity. If you want to talk about creativity, you can't do the block universe either. So his name will probably come to me because he's so associated with time, consciousness, and creativity. So I have a process view of time, but it's a big mystery. But now that you brought up the topic, I'm reading a book called Time Loops.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard of this book?
No, Time Loops.
Time Loops, and it's by Eric Wargo, W-A-R-G-O. Eric Wargo, and I mention this because if you try to find time loops at Amazon or something, you'll see 8 or 10 books, mostly science fiction. Mm-hmm. Wargo is a recent PhD from the University of Georgia, I'm thinking, an anthropologist, and he has done an amazingly scholarly job of looking at the possibility that people experience the future, the near future, in very concrete ways, in dreams and visions and so on. And here's the catch: these future visions feed back to what we do today. Mm-hmm. And I mean, he makes it fascinating case for this sort of thing. For example, I won't go into detail. We talk about this for an hour, but the famous, are you familiar with the very famous Carl Jung synchronicity case of the scarab beetle?
Chuck, yeah. Where you
well, there you go. So this lady is going, she's a client. She's going to go see her therapist, Carl Jung, who's famous for his weird and wonderful mystical ideas about occultism and everything else. And how does this work? She essentially creates the event.
Yeah, where she talks about the Scarabaeus beetle and he waves his hand and catches one in his hand.
And the beetle comes. Yeah. But the point is that she had dreams about this sort of thing ahead of time. And did she create the event from the dream? I'd have to go back and look through it.
But for me, this is really interesting because so many of the indigenous wisdom holders have a deep, deep attention to dreaming that, again, our Western culture doesn't, but Aboriginal culture, but anywhere in the world, indigenous cultures pay a lot of attention to dreams. And I certainly, I've had a number of experiences in my life where I would see a place seemingly for the first time, and then after having seen it, I would have this, and I still can't really put my hand in the fire for it, what I would call either a real or false deja vu of saying, wow, the place we saw today, I dreamt about 3 years ago in that dream, where I woke up thinking, how much detail was in this dream? Why did I in this dream go into such detail about a particular place? And then suddenly 3 years later, I find myself in exactly.
Well, you'll enjoy this book. Mm-hmm. And it gets even more complex because of the dream you had about this thing in the future may affect the way you respond to it when you get there. So there's this sort of feedback that's very weird. And when I first heard it, I couldn't take it seriously at all. But now that I've been reading his book, I have to tell you, he does a wonderful job.
I'll have a look at it.
I can't really recall the detailed stories right now. I wish I could, but he really replays Freud and a lot of the stuff about the unconscious, and shows that it could be, in fact, a product of this sort of weird reality in which people see things in the future and then essentially create them and say, oh, this was real. And I don't know. I'm not doing a very good job of describing it, but his treatment of Jung and Freud, the unconscious, and a lot of the symbolic material in relation to this strange business about time. And he also has a fascinating chapter about the science fiction writer, what's his name? Philip K. Dick. You know, 2/3 of the science fiction movies come straight out of Philip K. Dick. He lived near me in California, and he had precognitive dreams all the time. And he based his stories on a lot of them, and it was just very weird and interesting stuff. So anyway, time loops.
I'll look into him. Like maybe I'll even call him up and have a conversation with him at some point. The last.
Well, he would talk to you. He's a young PhD, and I think he. Oh, by the way, he talked at Esalen about a year ago.
Okay.
And people were very impressed by him.
The last question I would love your perspective on is another thing that I had this wonderful. It's somehow related to the notion of time, like this idea of the co-presence of the past and the future in the now. I recently learned from a Maori elder that the Maoris have a concept of time which is called Wahl, that is basically that the potential of manifesting is informed by the past, but the repatterning, which then manifests as a future, is happening in the now. And a related understanding to that is that in the Western world, we have this bizarre false dualism between so many things like humanity and nature, self and world, mind and matter. One of the other really bad false dualisms that sabotages us is this false dualism between theory and practice, that seems to suggest that our conversation right now has absolutely zero agency in the universe until we form an action plan and then go out and implement whatever we've decided the actions should be and the outcome should be. But if everything is non-locally connected and there's a much more dynamic relationship between consciousness and matter, and consciousness is possibly primary and matter secondary, then any kind of interaction and sense making in the consciousness space and us having a conversation actually does have physical agency across the universe. Does that make any sense to you whatsoever? I know out there as an idea.
Well, I've always been prone to be a softie for weird, wonderful ideas, and this is one of them. But recently I've seen more and more and heard more and more that really makes me wonder about these things. This book by that I just mentioned about time loops really makes you wonder about the nature of time. And Dean Radin's book, Real Magic. He's working on another one. I have his email address. He might be interested in hearing from you. His discussion of remote viewing and some other, but he's a real scientist now. He's in the lab, no bullshit for him, but yet he's written this book on magic. So he's quite an interesting guy if you can get his attention. He's not an academic and he's kind of reclusive, but He's very rigorous in his thinking. But I did finally remember the guy I was trying to tell you, the physicist, Ilya Prigogine.
Of course.
I'm sure you've heard of him.
Yeah.
What? Yeah, and his concept of time is based on process, in which, you know, it's like the dissolving of the sugar cube. Things scatter, disorder increases in some way. Now, he's not one of the people that argues that we're all running downhill. It's just that this process of change that's inherent in everything in the universe is the fundamental definition of time. It's a definition of time that's not Newtonian. Can't run it backwards. And it gives birth to all manner of creativity. So I don't have a list of his books in front of me now, but you'll see that he and others that have worked with him, let's see, Ilya Prigogine, I'm looking at AB books. Order Out of Chaos, that's one of his books.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with his work.
Yeah, well, there you go. And he's very interesting. I've been to, he used to be at a lot of the conferences I would come to, or a number of them with Irvin Laszlo. So I've heard him speak a number of times. And he's very impressive. He's, you know, this is not his main thing. He's got something else he's very interested in. Well, he's gone now, but yeah, this alternative view of time. And there's a physicist who's been writing very nice stuff about it. If you want me to follow up, I'll try to remember to. I just can't think of his name right now.
Yeah, no. If you do remember, like I want to take another deep dive into people's perspective on time, because it's something that, as early as when I did my master's in holistic science at Schumacher College in 2001, 2002, I sort of concluded that our, like in the you know, the overquoted statement of Einstein, that we can't solve the problems that we've created in the thinking that created them in the first place, and that we first need to change the way we think about things. I sense that our perspective on time is crucial to making a jump to a different way of reperceiving our role in this process. But again,
well, here's a book by him. I'm looking at my Kindle. Lee Smolin, Smolin. Amazing guy. He's a real physicist. I mean, he's a real theoretical physicist. He's highly regarded. From the Crisis in Physics to the Future of the Universe, Lee Smolin. I don't remember when this book was published recently. And it's titled Time Reborn.
Okay, Time Reborn. Excellent.
And from the New York Times Book Review, at once entertaining, thought-provoking, fabulously ambitious, and fabulously speculative. His books are very readable. Lee Smolin, yeah. Oh, my friend Brian Swim, who you know at Saybrook. I mean, Chess is a big fan of Lee Smolin as well. Brian is a cosmologist.
If Brian likes him, that's an even stronger recommendation.
That's all you need.
That's great.
Yeah.
So, in terms of people following up with your work, what's the, if somebody hasn't read any of your books yet, what would you recommend is the best place to start?
Well, the easiest book to read is, and probably a good place to start would be Consciousness Explained Better. That's a small book I really wrote at Ken Wilber's request to write a readable, popular book about his theory of consciousness, his view of consciousness. He complimented me by feeling that I could write a better book than he could.
Wow.
In terms of readability. Although he's a wonderful writer. They say he read one or two of Allan Watts' books out loud before he started writing himself to get the style. My book, The Radiance of Being, is about 20 years old, but there's not much in there that's really out of date. And it goes into my view of consciousness. See, we don't have time to talk about this, but everything I ever did had to do with system theory.
Mm.
And I used system theory to develop a view of consciousness and states of consciousness and so on. And it's pretty systematically laid out in that book. I've written a number of articles, most of them co-authored with Stanley Krippner, that explain this view, and I could send you one of those, and any of those are fine too. But in terms of readability, probably Consciousness Explained Better.
Yeah, no, I think I read both of those, and I think Consciousness Explained Better is definitely the entry level. And then if people want to go deeper and understand some of the concepts deeper, then the Radiance of Being is kind of the graduate version.
Yeah, that's the graduate text. But one thing about the much more recent Consciousness Explained Better is it really goes into some detail. I won't say technical depth, that's just an idea, but some detail about the idea of perspective. Because the four quadrants, when you get really down into them, are perspectives. They're not objects, they're not categories in the world, they're perspectives.
Yeah.
And I really worked to try to communicate that notion in that book, and I feel like I did a passable job of it.
Well, you won lots of awards for best science writing for that book, so it is really well written.
Thank you.
Can you say a couple of things more where you teach, because you currently you teach an online course through CIS, and you teach
it's at California Institute of Integral Studies. There's a department called PCC, Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness, where Brian Swim dwells, and
Rick
Sean,
Sean Kelly.
Yeah, Sean Kelly. There are some others, but those are the two closest to the kinds of things we're talking about today. They have a lady who's a new anthropologist there, and she's interested in ecology for sure. But Brian and Sean, I teach in a program called Transformative Studies, which is much more related to social sciences. And in fact, I'm the only one in the program that's sort of a philosophical psychologist, but it's very open-ended. The students, I have a number of students studying different aspects of consciousness for their dissertations. And I offer 2 courses on consciousness, the introductory course and one on the brain. And then I teach some electives. This summer I'll teach an elective on consciousness and the history of art, in which I essentially line up the historical Gebserian stages with works of art, and we talk about them, try to have some fun with them.
I remember you giving a presentation on that when you came and taught a couple of courses at Findhorn College and gave a talk at Findhorn.
Right.
I love that presentation. It's
a lot of fun.
Because
and I haven't taught it for several years, so yeah.
You should video, like, has anybody ever videoed you giving that presentation with that wonderful slideshow? Because that would
we've talked about it. Actually, my son, now in his mid-30s, is a comic book artist. And we've talked about making a comic book of the history of art. And he's up for it if we can just find some time for him to work on it. And one of my colleagues, transdisciplinary scholar Alfonso Montori, has encouraged me to write a book. So what I need is a year to write a book and not to teach, I guess. There's so many things that one can do. And, actually, you may have some interest in, let me just say it, there's a student from PCC, from that program, now graduated, who's become a good friend of mine, Linda Cherry, and she's a filmmaker. She's made a wonderful film on human potential kinds of, a lot of it has to do with trans-technology. There's this whole area now of everything from brain stimulation to EEG, learning and training. And so she's written a dissertation that looks at ways the human potential can be optimized. And it includes everything from traditional meditation to psychedelic agents that can be used to expand the human mind, to all kinds of electronics and stuff. And we're going to try to put that together with a book and a movie.
Now you opened up another box. I was just
sorry.
That's okay. No, I was just about to wrap up, but that is now too big of a question to leave hanging.
Yeah.
Which is because I actually had it somewhere in my notes. I wanted to ask you about this as well, which is I'm really concerned by the transhumanist agenda and the transhumanist story. This whole kind of, I know that in the Bay Area, it's almost impossible to not believe in, we're trapped in a situation of runaway tech where technology is evolving so quickly and we will not be able to put the genie back into the box or close Pandora's box. And
right.
Therefore, all we can do is to just sort of dance along with it. But I think that's a little bit of a fatalistic view. I think part of, if we are going to make it as a species, we need to develop a more mature relationship with technology, which to my mind is about choosing what technologies to use and what not to use, and understand that technology should be serving us and we shouldn't be serving technology. And increasingly it's the other way around. So what's your take?
I would not disagree with you at all.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a transhumanist. We're looking at things that have shown benefit with Alzheimer's patients, have helped people overcome depression and whatever. Those better self-control, better regulation of pain. I'm not one of those people that thinks we can upload our brain into a computer or any of that. Actually, the person that designed the brain, if you want to call it that, for what's her name? The robot that now is a person in Saudi Arabia, Sophia. Have you ever listened to Sophia talk? I mean, she's an android.
Mm-hmm.
All I have to do is look on YouTube for Sophia and interview with Sophia.
Mm-hmm.
She's actually been, as I said, given a citizenship. I think it's in Saudi Arabia. She's designed to look like Audrey Hepburn.
Oh,
She's
no.
a good-looking robot, yeah. And this dear friend of mine's the guy who designed her computer. And my wife says it's very scary.
Yeah.
I don't have an opinion either way, but Ben Goertzel, the guy that did this, is an old friend of mine, chaos theory friend. He was at one of the Tucson conferences, and somebody said, "Jesus, this is really scary. What are we going to do when these things, these quote unquote people, these robots take over?" And Ben said, "Well, I'd rather turn my politics over to a well-programmed robot than the people that are running it now."
Yeah.
So, but I am definitely not a transhuman, and I don't believe you can upload your brain. Ben's got this little thing hanging around his neck. So if he gets in a car accident, they'll cut off his head and freeze it right away. He can't afford to freeze the whole body. So, but no, I told him, we had this long discussion. I said, no, I plan to come back as a baby. I'm not doing this.
Yeah.
I'm a reincarnationist, you know. So if I come back, I hope to be a human being.
No, I think it's kind of the utmost perversion of the mechanistic consciousness, the kind of Hans Moravec and Ray Kurzweil version of transhumanism that we will download our
it's scary
and put it into a robot and then we will live forever.
If you think Kurzweil's book on the brain, I won't go into it.
Okay, so this has been really wonderful. We talked for longer than I thought we would, but I really learned a lot, and thank you so much for this time. I'm just going to stop the recording and then we can say goodbye. So thanks so much.